The summer of 1944 painted a deceptive picture of calm on the central sector of the Eastern Front. For the soldiers of German Army Group Center, entrenched in a vast bulge of Belarusian territory they called the Balcony, this was a strange and welcomed quiet. After the relentless Soviet onslaughts in Ukraine, this silence felt like a reprieve, a return to a forgotten stability. Men wrote letters home speaking of boring routines. Officers inspected well-maintained trenches and reinforced bunker networks with a sense of professional pride. They stood atop the most formidable defensive complex the Wehrmacht had ever built in the East, a deep labyrinth of minefields, interlocking gun positions, and anti-tank ditches anchored by urban fortresses like Vitebsk, Orsha, and Bobruisk, cities declared by Hitler himself as Festungen, fortresses to be held to the last man. The very geography seemed an ally. Endless forests, vast swamps, and wide rivers channeled any potential attack into killing zones pre-sighted by artillery. From the perspective of a German machine gunner in his concrete nest or a lieutenant surveying his sector, the position appeared impregnable. They had weathered Soviet attacks before. They would do so again. This confidence was the first layer of the trap, carefully cultivated and soon to be shattered. Beneath this surface calm, however, a deep and corrosive sickness gnawed at the heart of Army Group Center. The bulge, while defensively strong in theory, stretched German forces over more than 800 kilometers of front into a thin, brittle shell. Divisions, their ranks depleted after years of war, were filled out with inexperienced conscripts or unreliable battalions from Allied nations. Their equipment was worn, and their mobility was crippled by a critical shortage of fuel and vehicles. But the most fatal flaw was not material. It was a flaw of the mind, emanating from a command bunker hundreds of kilometers away in East Prussia. Adolf Hitler's strategic directive was absolute and devoid of flexibility. Not one step back. Every fortified town was to become a Stalingrad in reverse, bleeding the Soviet forces white in futile assaults. This order handcuffed the army's commanders, forbidding the tactical withdrawals and elastic defense that might have saved them. The commander, Field Marshal Ernst Busch, a loyal but unimaginative officer, became not a strategist, but a mere enforcer of this disastrous decree. The army was transformed from a living organism into a static, paralyzed beast, ordered to hold its ground until it was destroyed. While the German soldier cleaned his rifle and trusted in concrete, a colossal and merciless intelligence operation was watching his every move. Unseen in the dawn mists, Soviet reconnaissance planes crisscrossed the front daily, their cameras capturing not just trenches, but the patterns of life behind them. Supply dumps, command posts, artillery positions. On the ground, networks of partisan spies and scouts, moving like ghosts through the dense forests, provided detailed sketches of fortifications and troop rotations. All this information flowed into the headquarters of the Soviet Supreme High Command, the Stavka, in Moscow. There, in map rooms, thick with cigarette smoke, a different picture of the Belarusian balcony emerged. Soviet generals like Zhukov, Vasilevsky, and Rokossovsky did not see an unbreakable wall. They saw a giant, exposed salient with vulnerable flanks. They saw long, fragile supply lines snaking back to Poland over a handful of railway lines. They saw an enemy army frozen in place by the very orders that claimed to strengthen it. They saw, with chilling clarity, not a fortress, but a perfect kill box. The final, masterful stroke of this opening act was the cultivation of a strategic blindfold. Knowing German intelligence would be searching for signs of the next blow, the Stavka launched an audacious campaign of deception, codenamed Maskirovka. They became theatrical directors of misinformation. Entire dummy tank armies made of wood and canvas sprang up in the south, opposite Ukraine. Radio networks crackled with fake traffic about troop movements and supply needs for non-existent formations. Soviet commanders known to the Germans were visibly transferred to southern fronts. The goal was simple and devastating: to confirm the enemy's deepest belief. The German High Command, viewing the massive Soviet successes in Ukraine, was utterly convinced the next offensive would come there. Army Group Center's role, they thought, was secondary, to hold and perhaps support. Reserves, including precious panzer divisions, were shifted south. Attention drifted. The quiet sector was allowed to remain quiet, its impending doom mistaken for irrelevance. In his bunker, the German soldier felt a false security. In Moscow, the Soviet planner felt the cold satisfaction of a predator that has perfectly circled its prey. The stage was not set for a battle, but for an annihilation. The illusion of the fortress was complete. Now it was time to demonstrate it was made of nothing but sand and shadows. While Army Group Center slumbered in its false security, a parallel war was being waged not with shells, but with whispers, ghosts, and grand illusion. This was the realm of Maskirovka, the Soviet military art of deception, elevated in the spring of 1944 to a strategic masterpiece. Its architects in the Stavka and General Staff understood a fundamental truth. To destroy an army, you must first blind its mind and poison its judgment. Their objective was not merely to conceal their intentions, but to actively shape the enemy's reality, to craft a narrative so compelling that the German High Command would willingly cooperate in its own downfall. The story they sold was simple and believable. The main blow, the knockout punch, would come in the south, in Ukraine, where the Red Army's momentum was already unstoppable. The central sector was merely a secondary theater, a diversion. They sold this story with the meticulous detail of a master forger. The operation began on the vast canvas of the Eastern Front itself. Behind the lines of the Ukrainian fronts, a phantom army came to life. Campfires were lit for regiments that did not exist. Dummy tanks, crafted from wood and canvas, were arrayed in clearings, convincing from the air, their shadows stretching long in the evening sun. Real tanks, when moved, did so only under cover of darkness, their tracks swept away at dawn, while the dummy formations remained conspicuously in place for German reconnaissance pilots to photograph. The airwaves crackled with a symphony of lies. Radio men, trained in elaborate scripts, transmitted thousands of fake messages detailing the movements of fictitious divisions, their supply needs, and their administrative chaos, all following a careful playbook to mimic the genuine sloppy traffic of a massive force gathering for an attack. Known Soviet commanders, whose presence signaled a major offensive, were publicly transferred to the south. Troop trains rolled westward only at night, in strict secrecy, while during the day, empty trains rattled eastward in plain sight, simulating the withdrawal of forces. This theater was performed for a specific, high-level audience, the analytical minds of German military intelligence, the Fremde Heere Ost, FHO. The Stavka's deception played expertly on their preconceptions and fears. The Germans, reeling from the recent disasters in Ukraine, were psychologically primed to to expect the next blow there. The FHO's chief, the gravely mistaken Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, became an unwitting asset. Each piece of fabricated evidence, a blurry aerial photo of dummy tanks, a deciphered fragment of a fake radio signal, was a tile in a mosaic he himself was assembling. His intelligence summaries confidently asserted the buildup in the South and downplayed any threat to Army Group Center. This was not a simple failure of intelligence, it was a directed, manipulated consensus. The German High Command from Hitler down received not raw data, but a polished, persuasive, and entirely false assessment. Strategic reserves, the lifeblood of defense, were dispatched south. The powerful panzer divisions, the fire brigades of the Eastern Front, were positioned to respond to a threat that was an elaborate mirage. Back in the real world, in the deep forests and marshy hinterlands of Belarus, a different, more tangible preparation was underway. Here there was no need for illusion, only for perfect, brutal secrecy. Hundreds of thousands of fresh Soviet troops, pulled from reserves and other quiet fronts, filtered into their jump-off positions, not in a dramatic surge, but in a slow, patient, and silent trickle. They moved only at night, along hidden forest trails and corduroy roads laid through swamps. Every piece of heavy equipment, the thousands of tanks, guns, and Katyusha rocket launchers, was dug in, camouflaged under nets and freshly planted foliage. Artillery positions were prepared with mathematical precision, but their guns remained silent, their crews forbidden from firing a single ranging shot that might betray their presence. The front line, to a German observer, seemed lazily inert. The occasional mortar round, the routine patrol, nothing out of the ordinary. But just a few kilometers back, a colossal steel fist was clenching, hidden beneath the earth and pine boughs. Soldiers lived in dugouts, their movements restricted, their cooking fires forbidden during daylight. The air itself felt charged with a suppressed energy, a collective holding of breath. The psychological chasm between the two sides at this moment was absolute. In German headquarters, marked with neat pins and optimistic situation reports, the Belarusian balcony was a bastion. In the Soviet marshalling areas, it was a marked kill zone. The Soviet soldier, crouched in his concealed trench, knew a great storm was coming. He felt the earth tremble with the distant, hidden movement of tanks. He saw the mountains of ammunition stockpiled under camouflage. He was told nothing of the grand deceptions, but he understood the weight of the silence, the seriousness of the secrecy. Meanwhile, the German soldier in his opposite trench, staring at the same quiet wood line, saw only stillness. He listened to the same quiet and heard peace. He received letters from home, rumors from his officers about the big battle brewing in the south. He cleaned his weapon, repaired a section of barbed wire, and allowed himself a sliver of hope that perhaps, for him and his comrades in the center, the worst of the war had passed. This disconnect in perception was the ultimate triumph of the Soviet architects. They had not only hidden their strength, they had weaponized the enemy's own sense of relief. They had turned the German High Command's gaze firmly to the south, while in the center, in the profound and deceptive quiet, they finalized the preparations for the most concentrated, violent, and decisive blow of the entire war on the Eastern Front. The clock was ticking down to 0 hour, and one side did not even know it was counting. The final, decisive element of the Soviet plan was not launched from the barrels of guns or the tracks of tanks, but from the shadowy, vast world behind German lines. It relied not on regular army divisions, but on a parallel army of ghosts and hunters who knew every forest path and village elder, the Belarusian partisans. Their role was not traditional guerrilla warfare. In Operation Bagration, they were transformed into a strategic instrument of surgical precision, tasked with performing a single, catastrophic act of paralysis on the very nervous system of Army Group Center, its railways. This was Operation Rail War, a coordinated symphony of destruction on a scale never before imagined, and its conductor was in Moscow, synchronizing the watches of hundreds of isolated detachments deep in the German rear. For weeks, a secret and lethal logistical operation had been underway. Aircraft flying under the cover of darkness and bad weather made perilous landings on hidden forest clearings. Partisan guides met them, unloading not just rifles and explosives, but crates of high-grade plastite, detonators, and miles of primer cord. Couriers on bicycles and foot carried detailed orders, maps with coded markings, and the most crucial piece of information: the exact date and time. Every partisan, from the seasoned commander to the teenage scout, understood the monumental importance of their task. They were not just blowing up trains, they were severing the arteries that supplied life to the front. A German division without fuel, ammunition, or food was not a fighting force. It was a trapped, helpless mass. The night of June 19, 1944, fell over Belarus with a tense, expectant stillness. In the partisan camps scattered across the dense woods and impassable swamps, there was no campfire light, no idle talk. Small groups, their faces smeared with soot, checked their weapons one last time and hefted the heavy sacks of explosives. They moved out, silent phantoms filtering through the darkness, towards the slender steel threads that crisscrossed the landscape, the German rail lines. Each team had its assigned sector, its specific targets, not just the tracks, but switches, water towers, signaling equipment, bridges. They crawled to the embankments, the gravel crunching softly under their knees, their ears straining for the sound of a patrol or a train. The only light was the cold glow of the stars. Hands worked swiftly in the dark, planting charges, unspooling wire, making final connections. The explosives were not placed randomly. They were positioned to cause maximum, difficult-to-repair damage, warping the rails into grotesque metal flowers of torn steel. Then, as clocks across the time zone struck the appointed hour, hell erupted across the entire depth of the German rear. It was not a single explosion, but a rolling, continuous, earth-shattering detonation that seemed to have no beginning and no end. From north of Vitebsk to the fringes of the Pripyat marshes, the night sky ignited. Flash after blinding flash illuminated the countryside in stark, stuttering snapshots. Trees standing in skeletal silhouette, the twisted shapes of rails flung into the air, startled German security troops frozen in momentary tableau. The sound was a physical force, a deep, roaring thunder that rolled across the flat land, drowning out everything else. In partisan memoirs, they would recall not seeing the individual blasts in their sector, but seeing the entire horizon flicker with distant, silent light, like a tremendous summer lightning storm without rain. Over 10,000 explosions ripped through the night. In a single coordinated strike, the partisans had not just damaged the German rail network, they had annihilated it. The effect behind the lines was instantaneous and total chaos. At dawn on June 20th, German logistics officers faced a nightmare beyond comprehension. Their meticulously planned timetables were now worthless scrolls. The rail map of Belarus, once a neat diagram of supply flows, was a splintered wreck. Key junctions were isolated. Dozens of vital trains carrying fuel for panzer reserves, ammunition for artillery, and reinforcements for the frontline divisions were now stranded in the middle of nowhere, sitting ducks on severed lines, or trapped between demolished sections. Repair crews, overwhelmed and under constant threat of partisan ambush, scrambled to the sites, only to find the damage was too extensive, too widespread. There was no quick fix. The flow of everything had stopped dead. At the front, the German soldier awoke to a different kind of silence, the ominous silence of broken communication. The routine morning supply train did not arrive. Rumors, faster than any official report, snaked through the trenches. The rear is in flames. The partisans are everywhere. We are cut off. A deep, primal anxiety began to seep into the fortified positions. Their sense of security, already built on the illusion of a quiet sector, was now utterly shattered. They were not just in a frontline bunker. They were at the end of a broken supply chain, on an island being systematically isolated. They looked out at the seemingly quiet Soviet lines with a new, chilling understanding. This quiet was not peace. It was the quiet of a predator holding its breath before the lunge. In Moscow, receiving the first coded confirmations of the operation's success, the Stavka planners allowed themselves a moment of grim satisfaction. The rail war had achieved more than any aerial bombardment could. It had not just disrupted the enemy, it had surgically removed his capacity to react. The mighty German military machine, renowned for its rapid movement of reserves, had been hamstrung before the first Soviet gun had even fired. The partisans, with their precise distributed violence, had transformed the entire operational depth of Army Group Center from a secure rear area into a contested, chaotic, and deadly space. The stage was now cleared. The enemy was blinded, deafened, and paralyzed. The Red Army, coiled and hidden just meters away, was ready to strike. The clock had reached 0. The night of exploding rails was the overture to the symphony of annihilation. While the German rear convulsed in the fiery aftermath of the rail war, the final, most daring piece of the Soviet plan was being put into position. It involved not deception or sabotage, but a brazen act of military engineering that defied both German expectations and the very logic of the terrain. The core of the Soviet breakthrough strategy was a series of powerful, concentrated fist blows against the German fortresses. But one proposed strike seemed so audacious, it sparked fierce argument at the highest levels of command. It came from General Konstantin Rokossovsky, the commander of the First Belarusian Front. He studied the maps of the swampy, roadless lowlands south of Bobruisk, an area the German maps marked as impassable for heavy weapons, and saw not an obstacle, but a gateway. He insisted on not one, but 2 main lines of attack for his front, with the southern, secondary thrust to emerge directly from the heart of the Pripyat swamps. When challenged by Stalin and the Stavka in a tense planning meeting, Rokossovsky, a man who had survived the purges and German prison camps, reportedly demanded to be relieved of command, rather than change his plan. His unwavering conviction was based on a simple, brutal calculation. The Germans would never expect it. And in war, the unexpected is the most lethal weapon of all. Accepting Rokossovsky's gamble meant solving an immense practical problem. Moving an entire army, with tens of thousands of infantry, hundreds of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, and all their supplies, through a landscape of sucking mud, thick peat bogs, and dense mosquito-infested forest, was a task that seemed to belong to the realm of fantasy. It required turning the swamp itself into an ally. This was the mission handed to the unsung heroes of Bagration, the Soviet combat engineers. Under a blanket of total secrecy, weeks before the offensive, they became architects of the impossible. Working only at night, in utter silence, they moved into the morass. They did not build roads, they conjured them from the landscape. Using locally felled timber, they constructed miles of corduroy roads, rough, durable pathways made of logs laid perpendicularly across the boggiest ground. They built sturdy bridges over countless streams and channels, their supports driven deep into the unstable peat, their surfaces carefully camouflaged with netting and living foliage. They erected causeways across the widest stretches of open marsh, creating narrow, firm spines of earth and wood where none existed. The movement of the shock armies into these prepared positions was a logistical ballet, performed in pitch darkness and under stifling radio silence. Columns of T-34 tanks, their engines muffled, crept forward at a snail's pace along the winding, spongy log roads, their commanders anxiously listening for the sickening crack of timber that would signal a plunge into the mire. Heavy artillery pieces were painstakingly manhandled, inch by inch, their wheels sinking into the soft ground beside the corduroy, only to be hauled out by teams of sweating soldiers. The infantry, laden with weapons and ammunition, slogged through the black water on either side of the makeshift roads, their boots making wet, sucking sounds with every step. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the drone of insects. There was no talking, no smoking, no light of any kind. The only sounds were the groan of wood under immense weight, the whispered curses of men straining in the dark, and the distant routine sounds of the German front line, oblivious to the monstrous force materializing just a few kilometers away, in a place they had written off as nature's own impenetrable fortress. On the German side of the swamps, the sentiment was one of negligent security. Patrols were rare and reluctant, venturing only a short distance into the forbidding wetlands before turning back. Observation posts faced east toward the obvious, dry avenues of approach. The sector was held by second-tier divisions, their morale already low, their commanders comforted by the geographical certainty that no major attack could come from the liquid hell to their south. Their defensive preparations here were shallow, almost perfunctory. They relied on the swamp as their primary co-defender. In their bunkers, they listened to the normal sounds of the night, frogs, wind in the reeds, and heard nothing alarming. The very concept of an armored spearhead emerging from the quagmire was so absurd it never entered their tactical assessments. This was the psychological blind spot Rokossovsky had gambled everything on. By the dawn of June 22nd, the third anniversary of the German invasion, the transformation was complete. Hidden in the swamps south of Bobruisk was an entire Soviet army, coiled and ready. Tanks were dug into hull-down positions, their barrels peeking through camouflage nets draped with swamp grass. Artillery batteries were zeroed in on unsuspecting German strongpoints, their gunners having calculated firing solutions without a single ranging shot. Riflemen lay in shallow pits in the damp earth, their weapons dry, their eyes fixed on the distant outlines of German trenches across the bog. The swamp, once a barrier, had become a vast concealed garage, a staging ground of terrifying power. The German High Command, still fixated on the threats to the more obvious fortresses, had no inkling of the cataclysm poised to erupt from the terrain they had dismissed. Rokossovsky's impossible attack was not just a maneuver. It was a statement of supreme military creativity and ruthless will. It represented the moment the Red Army ceased merely reacting to German strategy and began dictating on its own terms, in the most unthinkable places. The engineers had defied nature. The soldiers had endured hell. Now, they waited for the signal to prove that the impossible was merely a question of preparation and nerve. The silence that hung over the Belarusian front in the pre-dawn hours of June 23, 1944, was not the quiet of peace, but the pressurized, breathless stillness of a vacuum before a detonation. It was a calculated, weaponized silence. For the German soldier in his forward trench, shivering slightly in the cool morning air, this silence had become familiar, even comfortable. It was the silence of the quiet sector. He might have heard the distant cry of a bird, the rustle of the wind in the tall grass of no man's land. His watch was nearing its end. Soon he would be relieved, perhaps enjoy a hot drink. He stared out into the gray, indistinct landscape towards the Soviet lines and saw nothing moving. The world seemed suspended. This final deceptive calm was the last gift of the Maskirovka, and it was about to be shattered forever. What that German soldier could not see, hear, or conceive was the reality just kilometers away. Beneath expertly crafted camouflage nets and in deep, earth-covered gun pits, tens of thousands of Soviet artillery pieces stood ready. This was not a collection of guns. It was a single, integrated instrument of doom, meticulously tuned over weeks of planning. The Soviets had moved beyond the concept of a simple preparatory barrage. What they had designed was a scientific and systematic program of total destruction, a fire symphony with movements of terrifying precision. Every German position, not just the frontline trenches, but command bunkers, communication hubs, artillery batteries, supply dumps, and reserve assembly areas, had been mapped, numbered, and assigned to specific batteries. The data came from thousands of aerial photographs, partisan reports, and sound ranging. The Soviet gunners knew the location of their targets better than the German occupants did. At exactly 5 a.m., along a front stretching hundreds of kilometers, the universe erupted. There was no warning whistle, no single ranging shot. The first moment was one of absolute, all-consuming violence. The sky, still dark in the west, was instantly torn apart by a continuous, flickering, orange-white glare. Tens of thousands of gun muzzles flashed simultaneously, a blinding sheet of light that for a second outshone the rising sun. Then the sound hit. A physical, overwhelming wave of noise that was less a series of booms and more a single, sustained, tearing roar that blocked all other sensation. The earth itself trembled and buckled. This was not random shelling. The first movement of the symphony was the fire onslaught. For 2 hours, a hurricane of high explosive and fragmentation shells fell on the German forward positions with mathematical cruelty. The world of the German frontline soldier dissolved into chaos, dirt, and death. Trenvins vanished into clouds of soil and splinters. Carefully prepared machine gun nests were obliterated before a single round could be fired. Bunkers, deemed safe, collapsed under direct hits from heavy howitzers. The intricate wire obstacles were blown into useless, tangled scrap. The artillery fire then performed a sinister dance, lifting and shifting according to a precise timetable. It would roll forward to smash second-line positions, then suddenly reverse back to catch survivors scrambling from their destroyed dugouts. It isolated strong points by creating walls of fire around them. It was relentless, inescapable, and psychologically eviscerating. Simultaneously, the second, deeper movement began. The counter-battery concert. While the front line was being hammered, specialized Soviet artillery units, equipped with radars and advanced sound-ranging equipment, unleashed a targeted execution of the German artillery itself. The moment a German battery, stunned and confused, attempted to fire a single round in reply, it was located. Within minutes, a crushing deluge of shells would descend upon it, silencing it permanently. German command posts, their phone lines severed by the initial blasts, found themselves isolated, their runners cut down by the falling steel rain. The vaunted German defensive system, which relied on layered fire and rapid communication, was being dismembered node by node, synapse by synapse, while still in its cradle. For the defenders, the experience was one of apocalyptic helplessness. Men were driven insane by the concussion, huddling in the bottoms of craters, unable to think, to order, to resist. The concept of a coherent defense evaporated. Officers who survived could not contact their units. Reserves moving forward were caught in the open and annihilated. The fortresses found themselves not under infantry assault, but under a geological event. The very ground they stood on was being systematically plowed and turned. The Soviet artillerymen, in contrast, worked in a state of grim, efficient rhythm. Load, fire, eject the smoking casing. Load, fire. The guns grew hot. Mountains of empty shell casings grew beside them. They were not just firing shells. They were methodically dismantling an army. When the fire finally lifted and shifted deep into the German rear to block any retreat or reinforcement, a new, even more ominous sound replaced the roar, the high, wailing scream of Katyusha rockets, the Stalin's organs. Their indiscriminate, area-saturating fury poured salt into the wounds. Then, in the sudden, ringing, deafened silence that followed the rocket strike, a sound even more terrifying reached the ears of the shell-shocked survivors. The deep, massed rumble of diesel engines and the shrill battle cries of tens of thousands of Soviet infantry rising from the smoke. The artillery symphony had reached its crescendo and stopped. Its purpose was not just to kill, but to sterilize the battlefield, to erase the defensive will, to create a zone of blank, smoking ruin through which the Red Army could now advance not as attackers, but as occupiers of a freshly created wasteland. The gunners' work was done. The mop-up had begun. The apocalyptic artillery fire did not cease so much as it transformed. It rolled forward like a moving steel curtain, a deliberate barrage ahead of the advancing Soviet infantry that churned the last remnants of German resistance into bloody pulp. And from the smoke, the craters, and the shattered forests emerged the true executors of the Soviet plan, the combined arms assault groups and the roaring columns of tanks. This was not the grim, plodding advance of earlier years. This was a violent, muscular, and shockingly fast exploitation, a blitzkrieg in reverse, executed with a brutal efficiency the Germans themselves had pioneered and were now powerless to stop. The breakthrough had been achieved. Now came the utter, systematic dismantling of an entire army group. The German front line, where it still existed, was no longer a line at all. It was isolated clusters of dazed, deafened survivors, many without officers, their weapons clogged with dirt. Against them came waves of Soviet assault troops, moving not in broad human waves, but in flexible small groups. Sappers with explosive charges cleared bunker apertures. Flamethrower teams painted corridors of fire into strongpoints. Submachine gunners poured through the breaches. Resistance was sporadic, desperate, and quickly crushed. The goal was not to engage in prolonged battles at the front, but to smash through it, to ignore points of clinging resistance and leave them for follow-up units to reduce. The real objective lay kilometers behind, in the operational depth. The Soviet infantry, mounted on the decks of tanks and in American-supplied trucks, became a motorized torrent, flooding into the German rear areas. This was where the speed became terrifying. The Soviet tank armies, the 1st and 2nd Guards tank armies, and others, were unleashed not as a supporting force, but as independent, deep-thrusting spears. Their orders were simple and ruthless: bypass everything. Bypass fortified towns, bypass pockets of resistance, ignore flanks, drive west as deep and as fast as fuel and mechanical endurance would allow, to seize key road junctions, river crossings, and ultimately to encircle the German forces before they could even comprehend the scale of the disaster. The T-34s, now in their more powerful 85 military gun variants, raced down dusty Belarusian roads that just days before had been secure German supply routes. They were preceded by scouts on motorcycles and light armor, a screen that identified and brushed aside hastily assembled German blocking attempts. The German command structure entered a state of cascading, fatal paralysis. Reports flooding in were not of a battle, but of a collapse. They spoke not of enemy regiments, but of endless armored columns appearing where no enemy could possibly be. Behind them, to their south, cutting their only escape road. The fortress doctrine became a death sentence. Divisions ordered to hold their ground in cities like Vitebsk, Orsha, and Bobruisk found themselves surrounded in a matter of days, not by slow infantry, but by fast-moving tank corps that simply drove past them and closed the noose from the rear. The garrisons, their supplies dwindling, their hopes of relief extinguished as Soviet troops dug in facing outward from the city, were left to wither. In Bobruisk, the scene turned apocalyptic. Thousands of German troops, desperate to break out, jammed the few remaining roads and river crossings, only to be methodically annihilated by continuous aerial bombardment and artillery fire, turning the streets and fields into a grotesque landscape of shattered vehicles and corpses. The most symbolic and decisive objective was Minsk, the capital of Belarus. As the Soviet pincers, one from the northeast, another from the southeast, raced towards it, the road west from the city became a river of desperate humanity. What remained of Army Group Center's administrative apparatus, along with shattered combat units, rear echelon troops, and wounded, streamed back in a chaotic, demoralized mass. Soviet aviation owned the sky, strafing and bombing the columns at will, turning the retreat into a massacre. On July 3rd, Soviet tanks crashed into the suburbs of Minsk and, after a short, violent battle, liberated the city. The capture of Minsk was not just the taking of a city, it was the surgical severing of the spinal cord. Over 100,000 German troops from the 4th and 9th Armies were now trapped in a vast, shrinking pocket east of the capital, their fate sealed. The Soviet fronts, having achieved a depth of advance unimaginable a week before, began the methodical process of reducing the pocket, a task that yielded tens of thousands of prisoners. The speed of this collapse was unprecedented on the Eastern Front. In just 12 days, Army Group Center had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Its 28 divisions had been vaporized. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. For the Soviet soldier, this was a transcendent, vengeful momentum. They saw the evidence of 1941's retreat now in reverse. Abandoned German equipment, burning Tiger tanks, fields littered with enemy dead, and most powerfully, the endless, dejected columns of prisoners, the very image of a broken army. For the Germans, it was Die Großkatastrophe, the Great Catastrophe. It was the moment the war on the Eastern Front shifted irrevocably from a struggle for conquest to a frantic fight for survival, with the Red Army dictating the pace, the direction, and the terrible price. The hunter had become the hunted, and the hunt was conducted at a furious, mechanized gallop that left no time for recovery, for regrouping, for anything but panicked flight and annihilation. As the walls of the Soviet offensive closed in, the German High Command performed a desperate, last-ditch maneuver. They called for the firemen. On June 28th, Field Marshal Walter Model, the tough, monocled troubleshooter nicknamed the F. Herrer's Fireman for his knack for stabilizing collapsing fronts, was given the impossible task. He replaced the disgraced Ernst Busch, taking command of the ruins of Army Group Center, while simultaneously retaining command of Army Group North Ukraine. This dual appointment was a testament to both Model's reputation and the profound depth of the German crisis. They were sending their best defensive specialist into a burning building, but failed to realize the structure was already collapsing into its own foundation. Model flew into the maelstrom, his aircraft circling over chaotic airfields, his mind racing to grasp a situation that was disintegrating faster than orders could be issued. Model's arrival symbolized the final, tragic phase of the German catastrophe, the collision of iron will with irreversible reality. He was a master of the tactical counterstroke, of stitching together a ragged front with sheer force of personality and the shrewd use of reserves. But in Belarus in July 1944, every tool he relied on had been stripped from him before he even landed. His first demand, for reinforcements, for the powerful panzer divisions held in reserve, met with hollow echoes. Those reserves did not exist. They had been sent south, deceived by the Soviet maskirovka, and were now hundreds of kilometers away, entangled in their own battles, or desperately trying to entrain on a shattered railway network, still smoldering from the partisan rail war. The reinforcements he did receive were ad hoc battle groups, fragments of training units, and weary divisions scraped from quieter sectors, arriving piecemeal and far too late. They were droplets of water tossed into a volcano. Model's second instinct was to impose order, to create a new defensive line. He barked commands, ordering shattered units to stand fast at key river lines like the Berezina, to hold vital road junctions. But the machinery of command had been irreparably smashed. Radio communication was sporadic. Couriers were killed or captured. Divisions he believed to be fighting were already surrounded and dissolving. Corps headquarters were overrun by Soviet tank columns. The maps on his situation table were fiction. The red arrows representing Soviet advances were outdated the moment they were drawn. He was attempting to play chess while his opponent was systematically setting the board on fire. The speed of the Soviet armored thrusts created a phenomenon the Germans called Kesselschlacht, cauldron battle. But this was different. It was not one cauldron. It was a rapid, successive series of them. Vitebsk, Bobruisk, Mogilev, Minsk, each created before a coherent defense could be organized around it. Model found himself not commanding an army group, but presiding over its autopsy. The most profound force working against Model was not the Soviet army, but the legacy of his own supreme commander. Adolf Hitler's inflexible, hold at all costs doctrine had turned Army Group Center's defensive layout into a death warrant. The fortresses had not bled the Soviets white. They had acted as convenient anchor points for the Soviet encirclements, pinning down tens of thousands of German troops who were then neatly bagged. Model, despite his reputation for sometimes ignoring Hitler's orders, could not magic away the consequences of that initial, fatal disposition. Every attempt to orchestrate a fighting retreat to a new, shorter line was haunted by the ghosts of those already lost divisions and by the continued manic insistence from the wolf's lair that ground be held that was already in Soviet hands. He was trying to build a dike with sand under a command that denied the existence of the tidal wave. For the common German soldier in this chaos, Model's appointment meant nothing. Their world had shrunk to the terror of the forest, the constant dread of the sound of T-34 engines behind them, the howl of the Il-2 Sturmovik aircraft hunting them in the open. Cohesion evaporated. Columns became mobs. Discipline gave way to the primal instinct for survival. They abandoned heavy weapons, burned their vehicles for lack of fuel, and split into small groups trying to filter westward through the Soviet cordons. The proud Wehrmacht was reduced to a scattered, fleeing rabble. Model, the fireman, stood amidst the ashes, his hoses cut, his water supply dry, watching the inferno consume the last recognizable structures of his command. His presence underscored the ultimate irony. The Germans had sent for a surgeon, but the patient was already in the final throes of death. The collapse of Army Group Center was not a military defeat. It was a systemic annihilation, proving that no amount of tactical genius at the 11th hour could remedy a catastrophic failure of strategy, intelligence, and command that had been months in the making. The firemen had arrived, only to confirm that everything was already burned to the ground. The dust over the Belarusian fields settled not in weeks, but in a ghastly, lingering haze of smoke, cordite, and despair. The human and material wreckage of Army Group Center defied immediate comprehension. The statistics, cold and monumental, told a story of utter dissolution. Over 300,000 German soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. 28 divisions erased from the order of battle. A front line pushed westwards by more than 600 kilometers, from the gates of Moscow to the banks of the Vistula River in Poland. The Soviet blitzkrieg, Operation Bagration, was not merely a victory. It was a geopolitical earthquake that cracked the Eastern Front wide open and shifted the tectonic plates of the entire war. But to view it only through the lens of scale is to miss its true, enduring significance. Bagration was a clinical masterpiece, a symphony of modern warfare where every instrument, deception, partisan warfare, engineering, artillery, and deep armored maneuver played its part in perfect, devastating harmony. Its legacy is not one of simple, brute force, but of chilling, intellectual brilliance. The operation stands as the most complete validation of the concept of deep battle theory, a Soviet military doctrine developed in the 1930s and now executed with fatal perfection. This was not a battle of attrition. It was a battle of paralysis and surgical dismemberment. The partisans severed the nervous system. The Maskirovka blinded the enemy's mind. The artillery crushed its bones. The tank armies then sliced through its arteries, moving with a speed and depth that transformed a tactical breakthrough into a strategic catastrophe. Bagration proved that the Red Army had not only absorbed the painful lessons of 1941, but had synthesized them into something more advanced, more flexible, and more ruthless than the German blitzkrieg it had once fallen victim to. This was a system defeating a system, a command structure at the height of its powers, dismantling one imprisoned by its own dogma. For the German soldier and the German psyche, the shock was existential. The term Die grosse Katastrophe, the Great Catastrophe, entered the vocabulary with a weight that Stalingrad, for all its symbolism, did not carry. Stalingrad was a grueling street-by-street siege far from home. Bagration was an annihilation on a continental scale, a collapse of an entire army group in the heart of Europe, on territory they had occupied for 3 years. The images of the seemingly endless columns of broken, dusty prisoners marching through the streets of Moscow in Operation the Great Waltz were broadcast not as propaganda of defiance, but as a stark, humiliating display of total defeat. The myth of German tactical and operational invincibility was not just broken. It was ground into the Belarusian mud under the tracks of the T-34. The ripples of this victory extended far beyond the battlefield. It created a strategic tsunami that washed over the entire war. The catastrophic losses in the East forced Germany to strip its forces from the Western Front, critically weakening their ability to resist the Allied advance after D-Day. It brought the Red Army to the gates of Warsaw and the borders of East Prussia, triggering the abortive Warsaw Uprising and irrevocably placing Eastern Europe in the Soviet sphere of influence, shaping the political map of the world for the next half-century. Bagration was the anvil upon which the fate of Nazi Germany was finally and irrevocably hammered out. After this, the war in the East became a relentless, unstoppable advance to Berlin. Yet, the ultimate lesson of Bagration, studied in war colleges, from Sandhurst to Fort Leavenworth to Beijing, is one of holistic artistry. It demonstrates that supreme military success lies not in the dominance of a single arm, be it tanks, planes, or infantry, but in the seamless, orchestrated integration of all elements of national power: intelligence, logistics, partisan warfare, industrial might, and command ingenuity. It is a story of how to think several moves ahead of a formidable opponent, how to turn their greatest strengths, their fortified positions, their confidence, their rigid chain of command, into their most profound vulnerabilities. The operation's genius lies in its layers: the patient, invisible preparation, the single shattering moment of application, and the relentless, exploitative follow-through. Today, the quiet forests and fields of Belarus hold the silent, solemn evidence of that storm: the overgrown trenches, the memorials, the unmarked graves. Operation Bagration endures not as a relic of a past war, but as a canonical text in the annals of conflict. It is a sobering reminder that in war the most dangerous enemy is not the one with the most guns, but the one with the most cunning plan, the one who masters the art of making the impossible inevitable, and who executes that vision with a totality that leaves history itself breathless. It was the perfect storm, conceived by human minds, unleashed by human will, and it forever changed the face of the world.